Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, maybe also. I'm very pleased to welcome you for this session in the framework of the third edition of the Paris Peace Forum, which is dedicated to multilateralism in America. I think that this session is much more than timely, given the recent events we have all observed during the last week. And it's my real pleasure and privilege to manage to moderate this session with three panelists who are first Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is the CEO of New America, which is a leading think tank in the US. Professor Slaughter has a very rich experience as an academic at Princeton, but also as a policymaker because she was the first woman to be appointed at head of the US policy planning staff. Second, we have with us Stuart Patrick, who is the senior fellow for global governance at CFR, which is also a deep partner of the forum. He is also the manager of the Council of Councils, by the way, a long-standing friend of mine. So Stuart, good to have you this afternoon, Paris time. And to finish, we have Martin Abubu, who is the VP for International Program at the Ford Foundation. Martin, very good to have you also on board for this session. So I think there are three basic questions for this session. The very first one is to ask ourselves about the long-lasting effects of the Trump administration in terms of multilateralism. In a sense, there is Trump, but there is also Trumpism. And I think that we should think about the consequences of Trumpism, even if it's not so easy to be defined. Second, what sort of new multilateralism could we expect from the Biden administration? And last, I think it's very important for the forum to be very specific and to try to identify the issues on which we could expect some progress in terms of multilateralism. So before giving the floor to Anne-Marie for a brief presentation, I remind you that you can ask some question, and in the second part of our session, I will also the Q&A. Thank you very much, and Anne-Marie, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be here, even if I would prefer actually to be in Paris. So let me start by saying that the Biden administration will begin, as President Biden has already said, by telling the world and making it clear that the United States is back, that the internationalist, multilateralist, engaged United States is once again there, and he will do things on his first day, like rejoin the Paris Agreement, rejoin the World Health Organization, do the things that, frankly, a normal Republican or Democratic administration will do. But here are some of the things that have changed and will stay changed. A Biden administration's foreign policy will be focused on domestic renewal, on deterrence, and on democracy. On domestic renewal, President Biden is no isolationist, but his advisors and really across the party agree that the United States cannot play the role it needs to play internationally unless we renew ourselves at home, unless we rebuild our infrastructure, invest in technology and innovation, in education, and very much in equity. So we will be, again, concentrating our resources on that domestic renewal. The second big change, and then we can talk about this in the question period, will be that President Biden will focus on an alliance of democracies. He has talked about the free world and said the free world is our future as well as our past. He is planning a G10, so the G7 countries plus Australia, India, and South Korea. His top advisor, Tony Blinken, has talked about a league of democracies or a community of democracies. That is very good for the United States and the European Union, but that may put some countries in a somewhat more uncomfortable position where the world is defined as autocracy versus democracy, obviously then against China and Russia. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Anne-Marie, I turn now to Stuart.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and delighted to be here for the troisième édition. I'm looking forward to the quatrième, as Anne-Marie suggested, in person next year. Obviously, Joe Biden's commitment to multilateralism should be welcomed by anybody who values international cooperation, particularly in dealing with transnational issues that define our age. But I think while there is a lot of grounds for hope and even temporary elation amongst internationalists, I think it's important not to get carried away given the enduring impact that Trump is going to have and the domestic and international constraints that face the new president. On Trump's enduring impact, the hangover from his presidency will be pretty long lasting. He's gone, Trumpism will live on. You see this now in the unwillingness of leading Republicans to, risk offending Donald Trump's fragile sensibilities by actually telling him that he lost, shows that this remains the party of Trump. And so I think we can expect his hyper-nationalist, sovereignty-obsessed, unilateralist, isolationist, protectionist, and nativist impulses to continue to resonate with his base. It's worth noting that Trump enjoyed near 90% approval rating amongst Republicans prior to the election. He shattered what had been obviously a bipartisan internationalist foreign policy consensus going back some 13 administrations. And although most Americans, when polled before the election, actually supported internationalism and globalization, the partisan divide is huge, and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which publishes polling regularly, titled its last report, "Divided We Stand." It's remarkable the degree to which Republicans and Democrats occupy different planets, much less the same different countries. And this is really striking in the divergence over American exceptionalism. It's remarkable that 35% of Democrats, only 35%, now agree that the United States has, quote, a unique character that makes it the greatest country in the world, which used to be sort of a stock phrase for many Americans. Fully 80% of Republicans still hold this view. And there was some talk about the landscape on Capitol Hill. Unless the Democrats can pull two rabbits out of a hat in the state of Georgia, the Senate is going to remain in Republican hands. And that's going to constrain opportunities for U.S. multilateralism, particularly when it comes to money. The other force that Trump set loose was international, and that was reducing confidence in U.S. global leadership or even predictability in international affairs. Now, scholars of international relations talk about balancing and bandwagoning as two strategies. But what we've seen in the Trump years is what people call hedging, which is basically countries, including close partners of the United States, that they haven't stood still over the last 4 years. Many of them have tried to reduce their exposure to international or geopolitical risk by pursuing, for instance, strategic autonomy, dear to many Europeans' hearts, and creating ambiguity in their alignments. And last week, American voters chose they cast their ballots, and in coming weeks and months, other countries are going to cast their ballots with respect to Americans' aspirations of leadership. Just three of the most pressing issues for cooperation in the wake of a Biden victory, if I might mention. The first is pandemic disease, and obviously, as was alluded to, the president-elect president is going to enter office in the midst of the greatest public health emergency in a century. And yes, at the immediate stroke of a pen, he can rescind the announcement of a pending withdrawal from WHO. But beyond that quick win, I would anticipate that the president will want to join COVAX. I believe that he will probably want to try to make that permanent to avoid vaccine nationalism in the future. Other items would be ramping up the global health security agenda that the Obama administration pursued, seeking to augment the resources and authorities of the World Health Organization, including strengthening international health regulations, and also improving systems of early warning. With respect to climate change, yes, can rejoin the Paris Agreement in a sense by the stroke of a pen, because it was done as an executive agreement as opposed to a formal treaty, and that could take effect within a month. So by February 20th, the United States will be formally back in Paris. But that's the easy part, right? The $2 trillion climate plan that the president-elect has called for, which would have reduced emissions to net zero by 2050, joining the EU and a number of other countries or blocs, is going to be really, really hard given the landscape on Capitol Hill. The most realistic hope, I think, is for U.S. commitments to be credible internationally, is for the United States to invest heavily in green technologies. And that's something that could conceivably, particularly with respect to infrastructure, could conceivably get significant Republican support on Capitol Hill. Finally, there's the global promotion of human rights and global cooperation on that agenda. Again, as Anne-Marie rightly said, that does raise the risk of creating more fissures. If you free world and not free world, obviously it can imperil some cooperation that you need in certain spheres like climate change with authoritarian powers. Human rights policy has always been selective and often hypocritical, but nothing, I would say, approached the sort of rank amorality of the Trump era. And I don't have time to go into all of the strongmen to which Mr. Trump cozied up. Mr. Biden has pledged to restore human rights to a core component of U.S. diplomacy. And in addition to the Global Summit for Democracy that Anne-Marie referenced, I think we should look for him to signal U.S. desire to rejoin the UN Human Rights Council as soon as it can run for re-election, which I believe is in 2022, rather than, as the current administration did, abandoning that forum to some of the world's worst abusers. There are other areas we can talk about. I hope in our discussion we can talk about the WTO, big opportunities for breakthrough there, although notwithstanding the reservations of some Democrats on the trade front, to say the least. And then obviously also non-proliferation is another big issue. But with those introductory remarks, back to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Stuart. I keep in mind your idea about the type of U.S. leadership. I think it's an important issue on which we will be back. What about Martin? There are some positive elements, which were presented both by Anne-Marie and by Stuart. What is your assessment, Martin, after this Trump administration and with the Biden arriving?
Thank you, Thomas. And I would like to start also to thank the Paris Peace Force for this invitation. It is an honor to be part of this panel with these distinguished experts. I am not an American foreign policy expert myself. I joined this conversation from the perspective of an American private foundation with a long-standing commitment to international cooperation and global governance. From this perspective, I think that there is no doubt that the last few years have had a major impact in our expectations about multilateralism in general and America's role in particular. I think that the Trump administration and COVID during the last year have exposed the weaknesses and challenges of our global governance systems in an unprecedented manner. We have been talking about many of these shortcomings for decades, but the last 4 years have made it impossible to look the other way. The Ford Foundation is to some extent an example of the sort of complacency that existed before, where we were trying to avoid taking a serious look to these issues. We discontinued our programming around international cooperation about 10, 15 years ago. And only now we are re-engaging in a more systematic way because, it has been exposed in the last few years, the need to re-engage with multilateralism in a way that it's more urgent than ever, I would say. And the same thing could be said in terms of the long-standing impact of the Trump administration in American foreign policy. As the two panelists have already said, there is a growing consensus within the US that turning back the clock is neither feasible nor desirable. The most obvious case, I would say, is China, where the conversation has shifted dramatically during the last 4 years. But there are other areas where the consensus has moved and there doesn't seem to be a way back. Like, for example, the need to put American economic interest, not business interest, economic interest at the forefront of its foreign policy. This whole idea of a foreign policy for the middle class that Biden has been talking about, Biden and others have been talking about, is the perfect example of bringing this economic interest to the forefront of the foreign policy. And as Anne-Marie stressed, in the US, there is also the growing perception that America should put its own house in order if it's going to lead abroad, even among progressive. This is basically the idea that the best thing that America can do for the world is to become a more equal and fair country. And there is a lot of truth about that. And there is also a dangerous part of that statement if it means that America should pay less attention to what happens outside of its borders. So we should be worried about that risk. But at the same time, we need to be very much aware that the domestic agenda will be the overwhelming priority, and the foreign policy is going to be much more determined by that, let's say 5 years ago. So I think there is reason for cautious optimism, but there is also the need to be for a lot of realism when we manage our expectations about the new administration.
Thank you, Martin. If I try to make a line between the three presentations, there is this question of leadership. I will start with that. If you want to be a leader, you should have some followers. So what does it mean for the US with the Biden administration? And if you want to be a leader, you should have also a sort of to be a model in terms of morality. And the problem of the US is to have lose its, I would say, moral authority with the Trump's term. What could be, according to you, the main steps or the main issue on which the US and the Biden administration could try to restore a sort of moral authority? Anne-Marie, do you want to jump in on that? And I will ask also brief response from Martin and Stuart.
Martin put his finger on it again, that fundamentally, both as President Obama said in his inaugural remarks, as President-elect Biden has also said, and many others, America has the choice of leading by the example of its power or the power of its example. And as Stuart said, we're often hypocritical. We have never, ever been exactly what we say we are, but the gap between our professed values and ideals and our behavior has rarely been as big as it was during the Trump administration. So there are two things the United States can do here. One, absolutely, it must lead by saying, look, we are far from a perfect nation, but we are a nation that is constructed in such a way that we have a free press, we have a civil society that can point out when we are far from our ideals, exactly as Black Lives Matter and many other protests are doing right now. And that means we're going to try again. And this has happened often in our history. And that we are by no means perfect, but we try, and we continually can point out our failings and try to remedy them. So a lot of what we can do domestically actually can be very important internationally, particularly if we talk about how do we remedy inequality, how do we achieve far more equity, and how do we now see the nearly 50% of our 40% of our non-white population. The United States is moving toward a plurality nation where we will not have a white majority, but all those Americans of every color reflect and can connect the world. We should be pursuing a domestic agenda that also says, the many Americans of color who have come from other countries are links back to those countries. And to the extent we can increase equality, we are strengthening our ties to Latin America, to Africa, to Asia, and we're drawing on those. The other thing the United States can do is to lead from the center. Obama was criticized from leading from behind.
Not from the behind.
But the world, not from behind. But the world is not going to go back to the United States being out front and saying, follow me. One of the things that's very clear, I just was on a panel with Lord Nicholas Stern, who of course wrote the Stern Report on climate change. And he said, look, we have a much more, a world order of more distributed power. There's the EU, there's China, there's India, there's Africa, and of course the United States. But the United States has to be in the center, not the only center, but a major hub. It has to be working with as many allies and partners as it can. And it must also be deploying exactly all the actors that the EU and France are in COVAX, which is reaching out to philanthropies, to business, to civic groups. So the United States can say, look, we have extraordinary resources. We're connected to countries around the world. We're connected to people around the world. And our businesses and our civic groups and our faith groups are really at the center of many global networks. So there is a new way to lead that is more humble, but is still very, very powerful if we deploy all of our resources.
Martin, do you think that this idea of a leadership from the center is relevant? And what about the ones? What about the countries which will not be defined as democracies by the new Biden administration? Because if we have this League of Democracies, which was mentioned by Anne-Marie in his initial remarks, there are 10. That means there are a lot of countries outside these leagues. So what does it mean for them? And what could be their reaction with this idea of a leadership coming from the center?
Definitely, this is the key question that we will be facing during the next few years. During the last few decades, we have been discussing the future of American leadership, and that future right now has two main uncertainties. One is how will America lead, and the second one is who will follow and under what circumstances. And you raised this point. The Biden administration will have the opportunity to answer the first question in a very different way that the Trump administration did. And we should assume that, therefore, the answer to the second uncertainty, who will follow, may also be different. But America's leadership in a multilateral world depends heavily on the way the world sees America. And that image has changed dramatically in the last few years because of the Trump administration, because of the questioning of the democratic system from very different sectors, and because of the increasing visibility of a structural racism within the US. So America is not only a place, but also an idea, right? So whatever happens in America, the country, has a direct impact in America, the idea. And the idea that the world has about America today is very different than, let's say, during the Obama administration. And that is not going to be an easy fix. So in that sense, I do think that when we are thinking about American leadership, one key point is that whatever 21st century multilateralism we can think about is going to be less state-centered and a more network, as Anne-Marie always says, and there is a role for all kind of institutions to contribute to that. So the point I'm trying to make here is, regardless of the change that a Biden administration may bring, an American-centered multilateralism is going to be much more difficult to pursue because it may be less appealing to the rest of the world. And we need to respond to these new challenges in a concerted effort that would go beyond any administration, and many other institutions will need to be part of such effort. In that sense, I do think that the question of how do you deal with the question of promoting democracy is going to be a critical one. The US needs to continue embracing the idea of promoting democracy, but how it does it, it will be very different than what we may have been used in the past. And I think that none of us is expecting the US to go back to do what you were doing by the end of the 20th century. That would not be desirable in any way. At the same time, there is a need to go back to those key values that have run the U.S. foreign policy in the future and are no longer there. So how are we going to solve this tension is one of the key issues that the Biden administration will need to start responding.
Martin has made a very interesting point when he said that U.S. image has changed dramatically. Stuart, given your point of view and all your activities, I suppose you share Martin's assessments. Could you elaborate on that? And an additional question is also, we are observing the preparation of the new Biden administration with a lot of Democrats in the think tanks community preparing themselves. We know pretty well all of them. In a sense, it's good news, but at the same time, what lessons, according to you, were learned by these peoples, among them you, for instance, or among also them, Anne-Marie, what are the main lessons you have learned from the 4 years of Trump in terms of conception of globalization? Because I think that this issue is very important precisely to respond to the point made by Martin about the dramatic change of US image. Stuart, over to you.
Yeah, no, a number of reflections. I think that there's no question that there's been a recognition or a little bit of tempering of enthusiasm for globalization, because and a greater appreciation for its downside for the inequalities that have often resulted, dramatic social inequalities that have resulted. And so a sense of the need to balance the US integration into, or any country's integration into the global economy with some pursuit of social welfare, domestic social welfare goals, I think is one big issue. The other thing, I mean, just in terms of leadership style and how the United States presents itself, I think, less hubris, greater humility, probably fewer phrases like the indispensable power, a language that, in a sense, and language of American exceptionalism that often grates on some of our partners. At the same time, I think that there is a thirst globally, and also certainly in the United States, for less of an amoral or even immoral approach to issues like human rights. President Trump famously said when it was noted that Vladimir Putin was a killer who killed journalists. He said, "Well, you think we're so great. We've done a lot of bad things too." And I think it's important to be able to look in the mirror and at your own society, see its weaknesses, but then also not then take refuge in moral equivalence, as if there were some moral equivalence between, say, a totalitarian or authoritarian system and the imperfect, always work in progressy democracy that is the United States. So I think looking along, not being afraid to look in the mirror, but and trying to make America decent again, right? And making America decent again means both getting a more perfect union at home, but then also behaving more decently abroad, and that will be a nice thing to see, frankly. In terms of, I also think shared leadership is important. I think not only do we have to move from a monologue to the rest of the world to much more of a dialogue and sort of learning from their experiences. What are your experiences with climate? How have you learned how to balance your social welfare agenda with your openness to the global economy? I think there's also, as Anne-Marie is the greatest champion of networks. I think networks are quite important, and I think that the ability of the United States as an open society is at least in the past, sort of the quintessentially open society is quite well positioned. The last thing that I would say is that there's been this question of how much universal multilateralism should we be engaged in versus how much alliance of democracy should we be engaged in versus, how much should we be dealing with great powers in some sort of a concert system that's not really sort of normatively very integrated? The answer is we probably have to do a little bit of all of these, and that different global challenges and purposes will require us to be a little bit flexible and learn how to compartmentalize these different venues and formats for this task at hand.
Stuart, I would like to challenge you on this on a particular point. Anne-Marie and yourself said that human rights will be at the core of Biden's foreign policy. According to you, is it a way to be cohesive? I mean, to be able to build up consensus, or do you see a risk for the U.S. To be very divisive on that issue? The fact that the US will be back on human rights, do you think that's the proper, I would say, gate of entry to be back on multilateralism?
I think that it depends, as Martin suggested, it really depends on the way it's pursued and the instruments in which, is it a multilateral effort? Is it something that the United States is just, sitting there hectoring other countries about their failings, or is it, helping forge a coalition, for instance, a transatlantic coalition, beginning with that, but of like-minded countries that are going to insist on certain fundamental universal values as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and different charter instruments and treaties. And I think that, and the rule of law. And I think that, and then also expose themselves, for instance, within the Human Rights Council to universal periodic review. Come in, please inspect how we're doing here. So I think that it's a different tone. It's less hectoring, and I'm the first to say that there will be occasions when the United States is going to have to be selective. There will be trade-offs always when it comes to human rights policy with other interests that sometimes, although certainly not always, collide with some of these human rights considerations. So I'm sure Anne-Marie has some thoughts on this matter as well, perhaps more time.
Yeah. Before going to Anne-Marie and Martin and taking question from the Q&A, I would like to ask Anne-Marie and Martin the same question. Seated in Paris, multilateralism is a sort of magic word, and it's a sort of magic word for Europeans. But welcoming a lot of foreign guests at E3, I consider that the definition of multilateralism is very different whether you're in Beijing, in Moscow, in Ankara, and elsewhere. So could you try to define, Anne-Marie, your understanding of the Chinese definition of multilateralism, and Martin, the Russian conception of multilateralism? You can pick up another country if you are more comfortable with another one. So Anne-Marie, please.
So I will answer your question. I do want to say, with respect to the point about human rights, the Biden folks are talking much more about democracy than human rights. And when the world can see the video of a policeman murdering an African-American man in cold blood, it's going to be hard for us to push human rights in the way we have before. I mean, we can do it with other countries, exactly as Stuart said, but again, they're focusing more on democracy, liberal democracy, renewing democracy at home. I think multilateralism from the Chinese point of view means working through international institutions that you increasingly control, or that you increasingly are very influential in. That's honestly not wrong. The United States and Europe have wanted to work through multilateral institutions that we set up after World War II, and that together, anyway, we had by far the greatest voice in. Russia and China, of course, have vetoes in the UN Security Council, but overall, we invested in those institutions, and we could often get the outcomes we wanted. China has invested a great deal, continues to invest in those institutions. Trump didn't want anything to do with them. He was perfectly happy to tear them down. We're going to have to find a multilateralism now that, as I suggested, includes networks of non-governmental actors as well as formal institutions, really to build on open societies versus closed societies, and how can we best tackle global problems like climate change, like pandemics, like migration, cybersecurity, that directly affect people's lives.
Martin?
Thank you. Relatively a challenging question. So let me, I wouldn't dare to say what is the Russian definition of multilateralism. I am definitely no expert in that area. What I would say is that, of course, there is a tension between the way many other countries think about multilateralism and the very idea of human rights. So we cannot assume that we are going to have that sort of multilateralism that is suitable to China and Russia and still put human rights at the center of that conversation. That is going to be extremely challenging. And that's why I agree with Anne-Marie. The conversations around democracy, and open government are conversations that may have more appealing and maybe efforts that the new administration may pursue. But I do want to stress this idea that we should be thinking about multilateralism in a less state-centered manner. I don't want to mean that the states are going to be, have relative power. I think that states, of course, are going to continue to be at the center of multilateralism. But there are going to be many other ways of multilateralism, and climate change is a very good example when we are seeing a lot of that. And I think that part of the new administration critical piece is going to be how it's going to engage in this effort, how it's going to make a space for these other forms of multilateralism that are not necessarily about one government's point of view. And in that sense, I do think that there is an opportunity, because we can see that there is an increasing consensus around the globe in terms of having a multilateralism to respond to these key challenges. And if there is an opportunity to engage, I think it may make a difference. In that sense, the last point I will make is, I think that the COVID recovery could be a very interesting opportunity to explore some of these multilateral approach. The world needs to have a much more multilateral and concerted response to the impact of the pandemic, both in terms of health and in terms of economic recovery. And I actually think that there is going to be an opportunity for the US there in order to regain some sort of legitimacy if it involves in this idea of building back better in a meaningful way. So I do want to think that if you really want to contribute, you shouldn't necessarily go back to what you used to do. You need to look at the world as it looks today and see what are the opportunities there. And I actually think that COVID recovery could be a very interesting opportunity.
I will pick up and be back to you, Martin. I will pick up, the question from the Q&A, and thank you for all the participants for their questions. You insisted a couple of times, Martin, about this idea that we should think about a less state-centered multilateralism. And by the way, that's precisely the purpose of the Paris Peace Forum, to be more inclusive and so on. But at the same time, the list of the questions I received from the participants are asking about the multilateralism from a state point of view. For instance, I have a question about, do you expect that the US will be able to collaborate with Russia and China in solving human security challenges, such as global warming, for instance? And I think it's an interesting question, because maybe in all circles, we think in terms of an inclusive multilateralism for obvious reasons, but at the same time, precisely for global warming, is it only possible to think about some progress without a sort of state agreement between China and the US, like the ones which was made in Copenhagen, for instance? So on that, could you maybe try to elaborate about this balance between a less state-centered multilateralism, but also the need for states, and especially for the two big ones, to share or to try to work jointly? Martin.
Yeah, sure. I agree 100% with what you are saying. Basically, I think that the key idea is that we are not going to have an effective multilateralism without the states, right? Like, we need those key states to be actively engaged in multilateral efforts if we are going to make a difference. I think that the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not going to be enough with the states, and we need to be paying attention to all these other key players that are playing a more and more proactive role. And we need to think about these efforts in a way that makes a space to all these other. And you could argue that I am arguing this because this is what the Ford Foundation aims to do, and it's absolutely true. I am speaking from a specific position where we hope to be able to contribute to this multilateral efforts in a meaningful way. So in that sense, I don't mean in any way that we can put the states aside and forget about them. And we have seen actually this during the Trump administration, and all the part of the challenges that we had with multilateralism in the last few years was that we didn't have any engagement from the US government. So we need government engagement. The question is, do we only need government engagement? And what else can we do to ensure that A, governments play this role, and B, that there are other players also engaging in this kind of efforts?
Thank you. I pick up another question from the Q&A, which is maybe for Anne-Marie. It's a very policy-oriented question, I would say, because I am asked about, the fact that the Obama administration was very focused on Asia with the pivot, and our friend is also underlining that the Trump administration was very focused on some particular countries, especially against Iran, the deal with North Korea, against China. And the question is, what are, according to you, the expected focus regions for the Biden administration? Do you have a sort of list of priorities in mind, or do you think that it will be a very global approach?
Well, if you again read the what Biden's top advisors have been writing, China is of course still very, very dominant, and it is one of the biggest places where a Biden administration will differ from an Obama administration, because top advisors have said, look, we've been too soft on China, we have to get much tougher. And indeed, it's one of the areas where you've actually seen agreement between at least some of what Trump did and what a Biden administration will do. I think they will be truly mistaken if they continue to focus on Asia without focusing first on Europe. The mistake that the United States makes over and over again is to look at Europe not as the European Union, but as a collection of countries, and now Britain is no longer there. Before we look west, we should be looking east. The European Union is still the largest economy in the world. It has military power, economic power, civic power. The United States should be looking to Europe first, and together then forging common policies on trade, on the internet, on climate, working to have a common policy toward China. It will be far more effective. This whole idea of the G2 is crazy, and the United States is basically throwing away some of its greatest assets and its allies. And one more word just on the point about states versus other networks. The Biden administration should definitely be working with other states on climate, but frankly, Beijing and lots of Chinese cities and Russian cities are part of the global covenant of mayors on climate and energy that the Bloomberg philanthropies set up. There's no reason you can't do both at the same time, and if one doesn't work, you focus on the other.
Thank you. I pick up a third question from the Q&A to Stuart. And Stuart, if you can be concise, because we are approaching the end of our session. It may be important to note that Trump's actions were more about appealing to his base of loyal supporters. How do the nations of the world acknowledge this, while also recognizing most US voters wanted change by elected president elect Biden? I mean, the fact that there is this balance of voters, and there are so many voters, still for Trump, what does it mean?
Well, I mean, it means that the United States is a highly divided polity, and you see it. I mean, it's particularly divided if you focus on the Electoral College as opposed to the margin of Joe Biden's victory. But it means that most Americans are supportive of internationalism and multilateralism. As I said, they tend to be supportive of globalization. You've seen a huge actual change in, Democratic support has gone up for globalization, and Republican support has gone down quite significantly. Overall, the majorities are for openness and, in a sense, global integration, and not afraid of that. But it will mean that at certain times that blocking minority, or that very vocal minority, will be able to exercise some blocking impact on the way the United States behaves in the world. It also means watch this space. Depending on who the candidates are in 2024, we might have the third, 180-degree turn in the United States in the space of 8 years. I don't think that will be the case. I think that the trend lines are good in terms of U.S. support for multilateral cooperation, but hedging one's bets might be useful given how turbulent and volatile the U.S. political system has been in recent years.
Excellent. It's time for me to conclude this session by thanking warmly Anne-Marie, Stuart, and Martin for their contribution. 2 points maybe to conclude. The very first one is to remind this slogan made by Stewart, "Make American Dissent Again." I think that all of us will agree with that. And second, it seems to me that we should continue this discussion by a clear differentiation between multilateralism as a mean, as a methodology, and multilateralism as an end. And I think on that, there is a lot to be discussed. Thank you very much and enjoy the continuation of the Paris Peace Forum. Bye.
Thank you.